Tonight, we're going to continue our look at what were the issues behind the division between a lot of brethren, even churches dividing over certain things back in the 1950s and 60s, especially in America, and it made its way into South Africa as well. And tonight, we're going to look at the sponsoring church arrangement in particular. The idea that there is a church that takes on a work, either it's usually the idea that it's overseeing a work that is for other churches. So other churches send money to the sponsoring church and they consider this work part of their work. So they're saying we're part of this work, but we want you, this sponsoring church, to oversee that work. I think we might be able to look at the same type of thing from a little bit of a different mindset and see that it's still an issue, but we'll get there hopefully as we go. But we've already talked about having some separate organizations, especially with institutional boards. We talked briefly about this idea of helping those that are not Christians. And tonight we're looking at this idea of preachers or projects. Mostly we're talking about projects, but the same idea is true of preachers who have sponsoring churches that oversee their work. And it's on behalf of other churches that send financial support to the sponsoring church. I just want to point out that even in my past lessons, a lot of what I'm presenting is actually from a series of lessons by Bill Hall called What Was the Issue? Or What is the Issue? I think it's maybe the YouTube video that I found was called. But Bill Hall is an excellent preacher, an older man from around where I grew up, and he lived through a lot of this, just like my grandfather did, and he was presenting a series of lessons at quite a few places, and you can find articles based on that as well. I think he published a book about it, but we're talking about this idea of a sponsoring church as a middleman for the work of churches. And when we talk about the institutional board, a separate institution overseeing a work on behalf of churches, a lot of people could see that as a problem. There's nothing like that in the scriptures. A separate institution overseeing work for the churches. I mean, that's kind of an issue. But what about elders of a church overseeing a work on behalf of other churches? That's not so easy to see what the problem is, because churches and elders are scriptural. But why is it a problem? It's a problem because they have a restriction on what they are to oversee. You find this idea in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, where Peter says, "The elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion but willingly, not for dishonest gain but eagerly," and so on. And so this idea of shepherd the flock of God which is among you is the restriction. That's what elders are supposed to do. That's why elders were appointed in every church, because you don't have elders overseeing the work in another church. You shepherd the work, shepherd the flock of God that's among you. And in the sponsoring church arrangement, you have the elders of one church being essentially an institutional board to oversee the work of many churches. Now, historically, how this happened in a big way was that after World War II, so you had Germany and Italy and Japan losing that war to America and Europe, the rest of Europe, basically, and Russia, I think, and some others. But after World War II, some churches wanted to send men to help preach the gospel to the nations that were defeated. So the elders of the Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas, in America, said that other churches should send money to them, and they would oversee the work of evangelizing Germany. So they said, we'll take care of all of Germany. We'll make sure preachers are going where they need to go. We will oversee that work, and you just send us the money, and we'll make sure it's done properly. And the elders of the Union Avenue Church in Memphis, Tennessee said that other churches should send them money and they'll oversee the work of evangelizing Japan, and somebody else did that for Italy. And so that's something really big that happened. And so a lot of people at that time, well, they were seeing, well, isn't this okay? Because it's the elders overseeing the work. There's actually a couple of different problems with what they were doing here. One was that they were overseeing work on behalf of other churches. So not just their work, but other churches considered it their work as well. Very clearly, they did, because sometimes they would contact the preachers and deal with them directly, even though they would send the money through the Broadway church. And sometimes they were a little upset that they didn't get all the information from the Broadway church that they thought they should have in making decisions about things. But anyway, that was one of the problems. The other problem was that the elders of the Broadway church were overseeing churches in Germany. And basically they owned, well, not just them, I think some other churches too, owned some of those church buildings in Germany, and they were overseeing that work there. And of course, that happened a lot of places. That happened in South Africa too. But some who saw the error of having this institutional board, they had trouble seeing what was wrong with it, because elders are scriptural. But what they were overseeing is the problem. They weren't just overseeing the flock that was among them. In South Africa, we have this example I think I mentioned last time, the Southern Africa Bible College. There's a reason I keep bringing this one up, because it's actually the primary reason for the division in South Africa. We won't quite get there tonight, but I'm spending more time on it because of that. But they say that the Memorial Church of Christ in Houston, Texas, serves as the overseeing congregation of the Southern Africa Bible College. So elders in Texas are overseeing a college in South Africa. That makes sense, right? That's overseeing the flock among you, isn't it? No, of course it's not. That's not according to the pattern and the authority of the scriptures. It was founded in 1966. They said that they want to equip a new generation of emerging world changers for Christ who are growing to be Christ-centered servant leaders for the 21st century. That's a mouthful, but that's their goal. And so they said, because it's for Christ, then it's something that a church should oversee, and a church in Texas being that one, apparently. The Southern African Bible College is registered to offer these 1, 2, or 3-year curricula for study, and they can get accredited. They are accredited, so graduates can then go to other universities locally and overseas, and they get a degree in theology from there. And so you can go there for that. Now, is that something that elders should be overseeing? Some organization that actually has to deal with the government, with accreditation and all of that stuff, is that really the purpose of the church? They also say that when you give to them, you support them, you're participating in a worldwide partnership. So this is not the work of only one church, the church in Texas, Memorial Church. That's not the only one that's involved here. It's a worldwide partnership. And they say that for 40 years, the South African Bible College in Benoni has been training leaders and preachers for works of service in Southern African Churches of Christ. SABC is the only accredited Bible college that the church has in this region. Well, which church are they talking about? They don't mean the Memorial Church of Christ. They mean the church as a whole, the universal church. They say that the universal church has a Bible college here, and so they take money from other churches and individuals as well, but definitely from churches, sending money to the Memorial Church of Christ in Houston, Texas, and other ways as well. If you're in South Africa, there's a different way to send the money, but they're overseen by those elders. And that's just simply not what the elders were tasked with overseeing in the scriptures. The Bear Valley Bible Institute is something similar in the United States. They're overseen by the Bear Valley Church of Christ, But they have they've expanded to a global preacher training effort with 45 schools in 25 foreign countries. So while they could make a case somehow that as long as it was just there, the elders were overseeing training men for service in the Lord's kingdom. Okay, well, obviously churches are to do that. Maybe not the way that they're doing it, but in some way they're to do it. But are they to oversee an organization, which it is? It's a separate organization from the church. And are they to oversee an organization that oversees other organizations? And 45 schools, they have to oversee all of this. So they say whether in Colorado, Cambodia, or Cameroon, our schools build up the church. Well, they have oversight over all of these schools all over. And that's just simply not according to the pattern that we read in the New Testament. There's no authority for it. The same group, the same church, Bear Valley Church of Christ, that has that organization, they have this Higher Ground Girls Encampment. That's a camp for young women ages 13 to 18. Their aim is to assist these girls in developing holy minds and heavenly sight in this world. Sounds good, but they have each day classes, recreation, crafts, and fun, and devotionals. Well, okay, there's nothing wrong with those things. But is that what a church, is that what the elders of a church and the church itself is supposed to be overseeing and operating? Recreation and crafts and fun? Those things are for individuals to do. I have no problem with camps. I grew up going to a camp run by Christians, but not by any church. There was no involvement from a church in these things. It was simply Christians, and we could go and we did have some Bible studies, and we went and we had lots of fun. It was great, but it had nothing to do with the church, and it doesn't need to. There's just no reason for a church to be involved in these things when you don't read about anything like that being part of the work of the church in the scriptures. There's another one I found, a Church of Christ Care Community, just as an example of something that started under a board of directors. So that was an institutional board. Then they asked the elders of this Northwest Church of Christ to assume the oversight. They still had a board of directors, but then later on, the board of directors leadership was transferred to the Northeast Church of Christ. So anyway, that's something that, is taking care of the elderly a good thing? Sure it is. Is running something like this bad? No, except that for a church, it just has nothing to do with the work Christ gave the church. There's no authority for it. So there's a couple of things wrong, right? They're taking money from others to operate this, and then at the same so they're overseeing work for other churches. And in a couple of those cases, what they're doing actually isn't the work of a church anyway. But those you could say, are two separate issues. Mostly we're dealing with, okay, if it is the work of the church, then why is it wrong to have elders of one church oversee the work for other churches? And it's because there's no authority from Christ. They're to oversee the flock among them, not oversee other churches and their work. So the question is, well, what about when the churches sent money to Jerusalem, right? There were churches in Judea who had need. And was the Jerusalem church a sponsoring church? But if it was, then the idea of a sponsoring church is that it would be receiving money from other churches to oversee taking the care of needy Christians in other places too. But it was specifically for the Christians there. And so that's not a sponsoring church idea. They were actually taking money from other churches that were voluntarily sending it to them so that they could accomplish something they were required to do as a church, taking care of the Christians among them. And so the picture of a sponsoring church in this case would be something like Corinth the church there saying that they would take on the responsibility of getting aid to the poor Christians in Judea. So all the other churches of Achaia, Macedonia, Asia, and so on should send them their contributions, and then they would make sure it got where it needed to go. That's the picture of a sponsoring church. We don't see that at all in this picture. In 2 Corinthians 8 and verses 1 through 4, Paul talks about the churches of Macedonia, and he's telling the Corinthian church about them. And he says that they implored us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. So they weren't asking another church. They were asking Paul, who was talking to them about this work, saying, we want to participate in this too. And they didn't have to go through any other church to do that. In chapter 8, verses 18 and 19, he says, and we sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches, and not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift. And so the churches chose someone. They didn't turn over the responsibility to some other church to choose someone. They made their own decisions about what was going to happen with the gift that they were sending. In verses 13 and 15, he gives us the principle behind it. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. So in the biblical pattern, you have abundant churches, those who have more than what they need to do what Christ requires them to do, sending to lacking churches to cover their needs. So the sponsoring church pattern is where you have smaller churches sending to a bigger church to supply them with enough to do some big non-essential work. And when I say it's non-essential, I mean it's not required that they do it. They usually claim that it's essential because that's how they pressure other churches to give to them so they can do it. But if it was really essential, it would be something that has to be done by all the churches, not just one. Taking care of the saints among you is required of every church. That's why they were sending this money. So when you talk about cooperation, then we talk about the term anti. I use that in the first lesson. It mostly comes from anti-cooperation. So that's what people like me are called, who oppose one church or an institutional board overseeing the work of many churches. Not everybody would use that term still. I mean, we don't use it of ourselves, but that's what others would call us. But there's two types of cooperation. There's collective and concurrent. So if we understand this through an illustration, if you have needy Christians in a congregation, how can you take care of that? Well, one way of cooperating is that one family can make sure this sister has food, another person can open her home for another sister, and if you have enough brethren doing this individually, well, they've cooperated to take care of poor Christians. But that's called concurrent cooperation. Each one's just doing their part. And another option is that those brethren can give money to the church. The church as a collective can take care of the needy Christians. We see that as a scriptural pattern, and that's collective cooperation. And so in this example, both of those ways are approved by Christ. You can do it either way. But as far as churches cooperating, the only way we see them doing that is through concurrent cooperation, where each is doing its own part. You see this kind of concept in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 5 and 6, where he says, who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. They cooperated. Paul and Apollos cooperated, but concurrently, or doing on their own, right? They weren't in an organization together, making decisions together. And you can see that at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, but he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. So this idea of there's independence, right? Apollos didn't have to do what Paul told him. They were not part of one decision-making group. They made their own decisions, but they still cooperated. This is one of the verses that is used sometimes to try to justify it by dishonest people. I will just say that. Paul tells the Philippians that no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. And they say, well, you see, that means they were receiving money from other churches and then passing it on to Paul. But if you look at commentaries by denominational preachers, none of them have this concept. Only people trying to justify the sponsoring church have this way of explaining this. And it's just an accounting term, giving and receiving. He's receiving, they're giving. That's the idea. it's authorized for a church to send to another church if that church can't do what it's responsible to do. But the only thing I can think of that fits is when they need to keep brethren alive by providing for their needs. And if you say that it's authorized for a church to have a program of teaching, sure, that's part of the work of the church. But sending money to another church for them to operate their school of preaching isn't doing that. And it's not essential for any church to run a school. Otherwise, every church would be required to do that. That's what makes it essential. So if it's authorized to send money and to increase the budget of another church for them to do a big work, we should find that somewhere, but we don't. We don't find that principle anywhere in the scriptures. So that was a big reason for division, is this idea of a sponsoring church as well.